They were just kids. Some were born to unmarried mothers. Others were abandoned. In the 1940s and 50s, the province of Quebec and the Catholic Church saw them as dollar signs. So they forged paperwork, stamped them mentally defective, and shipped them off to insane asylums. There, they were drugged with experimental chemicals, strapped into straitjackets, subjected to lobotomies and electroshock, and when they died, their bodies were sold to medical schools for $10 apiece. This isn't fiction. This is Canada. And the people who did it, they were never punished. In 1948, the Canadian federal government rolled out a new subsidy program for provincial health services. It was supposed to help provinces care for vulnerable people. Instead, it became the engine of one of the most grotesque institutional conspiracies in North American history. The math was simple. The federal government paid Quebec 70 cents per day for every child in an orphanage, but for every patient in a psychiatric hospital, $2.25 a day, more than triple. Maurice Duplessis, the iron-fisted premier of Quebec, saw an opportunity. So did the Catholic Church, which ran virtually all of Quebec's social services. Together, they built a machine that would chew up thousands of children and spit out profit. The plan was diabolically efficient. Take healthy orphans, many of them born out of wedlock, others abandoned by families too poor to care for them, and reclassify their orphanages as psychiatric hospitals. Forge the paperwork. Stamp them mentally deficient. Suddenly, the same children were worth 3 times as much. And because hospitals weren't required to provide schooling, the nuns didn't have to bother educating them anymore. Between 1949 and 1956 alone, more than 20,000 illegitimate children were born in Quebec. A staggering number were funneled into the system. Researchers later estimated that religious groups pocketed roughly $70 million in 1999 dollars through this scheme, while the Quebec government saved an additional $37 million, simply by redesignating orphanages as psychiatric facilities. But the money was only the beginning. Clarina Duguay was just a child when she arrived at her orphanage in 1946. 2 years later, she was transferred to St. Julian Hospital, an insane asylum more than 1,000 kilometers from her home. Her father, living in Cape d'Esper, didn't even know she'd been moved until she escaped years later. St. Julian was one of many. St. Jean de Dieu, Mont Providence, Site de Jean de Dieu, names that sound like places of healing. They were anything but. Inside those walls, the children stopped being children. They became patients. And patients, in the eyes of the psychiatrists who ran these places, were lab rats. The orphans were given chlorpromazine, a powerful antipsychotic synthesized in France before World War II, later marketed as Thorazine in the United States and Largactil in Canada. It was nicknamed the chemical lobotomy because of its devastating effects on the central nervous system. Survivors developed tardive dyskinesia, involuntary, grotesque facial and body movements that never went away. The children were dosed with this drug as early as 1947, years before it was approved for psychiatric use. Some survivors remember being treated by Dr. Ewan Cameron, the infamous psychiatrist who conducted CIA-funded mind control experiments at McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute. Cameron's name showed up in children's medical records. But it wasn't just drugs. The children endured electroshock therapy, lobotomies, cold water plunges, and straitjackets. They were forced to work as unpaid labor, domestics, farmhands, hospital orderlies, with their wages funneled back to the institutions. Social worker Daniel Samar, who visited the orphanages in the 1950s, later recalled, "What struck me the most was the lack of love. The nuns showed no kindness or affection to the children. It was as though they were making the children expiate the sin of being born illegitimate. Many children couldn't even speak properly until age 4 or 6. They didn't know how to use utensils, tell time, or wash themselves. In one trade school, a quarter of children between 9 and 16 were still bedwetters. Not because they were mentally ill, because they had been deliberately deprived of human care. When children died, and many did, the system had a solution for that too. In 1942, the Quebec Legislative Assembly passed a law allowing the Catholic Church to sell the unclaimed bodies of orphans to medical schools. The going rate? $10 a body. The practice continued into the 1960s. No one knows how many children ended up on dissection tables. Albert Silvio, a Duplessis orphan who lived at St. Jean-de-Dieu in the 1950s, later told reporters that he personally transported more than 60 bodies from operating rooms to the basement morgue. I undressed them and washed them and prepared them for burial. We put them in cardboard boxes. Some of them were children. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves. Government registries indicate roughly 2,000 bodies at the St. Jean-de-Dieu cemetery alone. At least 42 were children. But the horror didn't stop at the grave. Former Montreal police officer Michel Lebel, who specialized in child abuse cases, discovered evidence of hundreds of unexplained deaths. And something even more sinister. When children died, unidentified people within the psychiatric system simply invented phony new identities, fabricating records to replace the deceased so the funding could keep flowing. Some of these kids died and were reborn 10 times, Lebel said. He called it an organized crime against humanity. Rod Vino, a spokesperson for the Duplessis Orphans Committee, put it in starker terms. This has been a conspiracy of silence from the beginning. The province of Quebec was just another Auschwitz. The children who survived were dumped into the world with no education, no skills, and no idea how to function. Many left the institutions as young as 10 and ended up on the streets of Montreal. They struggled with addiction, unemployment, broken relationships, and the inability to parent their own children. The trauma didn't end when the asylum doors opened. It became a family inheritance. In 1962, the Bedard Commission recommended deinstitutionalization, and the province began removing orphans from psychiatric hospitals. But the damage was done. For decades, the survivors fought for recognition. In 1999, researchers Léopold Lozon and Martin Poirier published a damning report exposing the financial scheme. That same year, former Quebec Premier Lucien Bouchard issued a public apology, but carefully avoided blaming anyone or accepting legal responsibility. In 2004, survivors demanded that the Quebec government exhume bodies from an abandoned Montreal cemetery, believing autopsies would prove medical experimentation. They accused officials of lobotomies, experimental drugging, and shock treatments. In 2010, only 300 to 400 of the original Duplessis orphans were still alive. Some took their case to the United Nations Human Rights Council that November. In 2018, a new class action lawsuit was launched, denouncing the earlier government settlement as an insult and demanding a true apology from both the Quebec government and the Catholic Church. Here's what keeps me up at night about this story. The people who forged the paperwork, the psychiatrists who injected children with experimental drugs, the nuns who sold their bodies for $10, the bureaucrats who sign off on the funding. Not one of them went to prison. A public apology, a financial settlement, and then silence. The records remain sealed. The graves remain unexhumed. The truth remains buried with the children. The Duplessis orphans weren't a family in any normal sense. They were a cohort of strangers bound together by the worst thing that ever happened to them. But in another sense, they were a family created by the state, abused by the church, experimented on by medicine, and discarded by history. And the scariest part? It happened in Canada. Not some distant dictatorship. Not some war-torn failed state. In a democracy. In a place that prides itself on being nice. The next time someone tells you that kind of thing couldn't happen here, remember Clarina Duguay. Remember Albert Silvio, carrying 60 bodies to the morgue in cardboard boxes. Remember the children who were reborn 10 times after they died. Remember that the only thing required for evil on this scale is bureaucrats who see human beings as line items, and a society that looks away.